Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Sharks 22-23 season preview. The Sharks just wrapped up their preseason with their final two games against the Anaheim Ducks and the Vegas Golden Knights just yesterday in split squad fashion, and you may be wondering why the Sharks preseason ended up being cut so short. That is because the Sharks actually played their first two games of the regular season, and generally the first two games of the regular season for any team, besides of course their opponent, the Nashville Predators, on Friday, October 7th. The Sharks are leading the way with a game overseas in Europe. Meanwhile, other teams will have a lot more preseason time. In fact, the very night that the Sharks play their first game of their regular season, there are still going to be teams playing in their preseasons. And so the Sharks were not given a lot of time to work with, but did play a decent handful of games during that bout of week period. And there were some conclusions that you could sort of draw from how certain players played, but that should obviously have a massive asterisk next to it, as the preseason must be taken with a huge grain of salt. A lot of people talk about the big difference between playoff hockey and regular season hockey. Well, there's an even bigger difference between regular season hockey and preseason hockey. I mean, teams are not playing at full strength. Even if they do have some of their more veteran and experienced players in the lineup, they're likely not trying all that hard, since the games literally mean nothing. And, defensive structures might still be getting worked on. There might be an inexperienced goaltender in between the pipes. And so generally, the preseason, it means very, very little going into the actual season. I think the best example of that is still the 16-17 season. That was a regular season in which the Colorado Avalanche had a historically bad year, 48 points in 82 games. That is completely awful. And yet, during the preseason of that year, they were undefeated. And so, clearly, it doesn't mean much. However, just dismissing literally everything that happened in the preseason because it didn't mean much is not particularly fun, and so I will still talk about how some of these players did do during the Sharks' condensed preseason schedule as we move over to Europe. I should also talk about the fact that it was just about an hour or two ago where the Sharks announced their roster of players that they are going to be bringing overseas, and I think it was mostly kind of boilerplate, but with one omission in particular that I will mention a bit later in the video. Spoiler, his name rhymes with Berkeley. But let's move on to the forward lineups here. At the top, I suspect the Sharks will likely go with a lineup of Hertl, Meier, and Cunnin. Both Hertl and Meier seemingly have come to play this season. Both had very strong preseason performances, putting up a lot of points in just the couple of games that they actually managed to play. And especially with the injuries to Barabanov and Lindblom, there weren't a ton of majorly great options to play on that top line with them. The Sharks immediately came out of the gate and decided to try Luke Cunnin, and actually it didn't work all that bad. Cunnin was a player who I thought would kind of just hang around the Sharks like third line, maybe get an opportunity on the second line. I wasn't necessarily expecting him to be tried on the Hertl-Meier line, but I do think this is probably the first line that the Sharks will take into game one of the regular season against the Nashville Predators. On the second line, we of course have Logan Couture, and I have him flanked by both Kevin Labanc and William Eklund. Now, Eklund is kind of in a variable type of position here. His preseason was okay, but not necessarily the type of preseason that you would hope for from a player you expect to have in your top six going into the regular season. And so, especially with the fact that Lindblom's position is very much up in the air, it is possible that Eklund does not get this second line spot. I currently have him penciled in because of the fact that Lindblom did not play in the preseason, and they may be a bit wary to actually immediately put him into that second line. So I will have Eklund's spot here, but I feel as though it's maybe hanging on by a bit of a thread. I was hoping for a bit of a better performance from Eklund during this preseason. On the other side, I do actually have Kevin Labanc, a player who had some hype-ish coming into preseason that he was going to be, more ready to play after his long injury kept him out for the majority of last season. And honestly, I will say his preseason was pretty good. It wasn't amazing by any means, but again, with the issues with Lindblom and the fact that the Sharks do not have many top six forwards to choose from, Labanc seems to be the best option here, and he actually showed some pretty decent chemistry with Logan Couture over these past few preseason games. On the third line, I actually have Bordeleau being flanked by both Noah Gregg Gregor and Nick Bonino. There was an article earlier that I saw that David Quinn is not necessarily going to hesitate to move Bordeleau to the wing, and I feel like that's basically a way to sort of have Bonino be a third-line center. But honestly, based on the fact that I wasn't super impressed, and that's putting it nicely with Nick Bonino's performance last season, and the fact that I think Bordeleau actually brings a very strong element to the face-offs, to the face-off dot, I would say that he deserves to be the center. Usually when it comes to these younger players, they're kind of just center by the fact that they play in the middle of the ice, and they don't necessarily take on the duties of what a centerman is usually expected very, very well. But I think Bordeleau is more mature than that and actually plays the centerman position quite well even at his younger age, so I think he could do that. And Bonino, we already saw, his probably best games with the San Jose Sharks last season were when he was on the wing. And so I think it would be perfectly fine to have him there. Them being also joined by Noah Gregor on that third line is kind of a holdout from last season. Obviously, when Bordeleau made his NHL debut, he ended up playing on a line with Balcers and Gregor, and particularly the Bordeleau-Gregor duo actually looked quite solid, so I am holding out hope there, but I would say that this is probably an extremely flexible spot. I had originally put Svechnikov in this particular spot because he showed some pretty solid promise during the preseason, but in the end, I decided to settle for Noah Gregor, but we'll see what happens. On the fourth line, this is extremely variable. The San Jose Sharks, as is tradition over these past couple of years, have a lot of players that are essentially really only good enough to be maximum on the fourth line, and that's exactly what's happening here. So the Sharks have Nico Sturm recently signed as a free agent, and I have him flanked by both Svechnikov and Gadjevich. Basically, this is because that these two had the most impressive preseason out of all of the Sharks' possible fourth liners. Gadjevich was a player who I didn't even want to see brought back as a restricted free agent this past offseason, but he was definitely quite impressive, especially when playing with Daniil Gushin, who I will get to a bit later during the preseason, and so I do think he earned himself a spot at the very least to start in the Sharks' main lineup. And the same would actually go for Svechnikov. Like I said, I had him penciled in onto the third line. I kind of hesitated a bit right at the end and put Gregor above him, but it's definitely possible he could play a bit more up in the lineup, and he may even find a spot on the second power play unit. A couple of the other players who are also going to Europe, but I don't expect to be in the main lineup, at least for game one, would be Lorentz, VL, as well as, of course, Oscar Lindblom. Lindblom is such a very difficult player to place at this point. It seems as though he is going to be healthy enough to play by game one, but because he had no preseason action, I don't know exactly what spot he's going to actually take in. I suspect the first line won't be touched, and Cunnin will indeed play with Hertl and Meyer. It's possible, like I mentioned, that Eklund could get moved down to the third line and replace someone like Gregor, and then have Gregor move down and replace someone like Gadjevich. I'm not entirely sure, but it's also very much possible that they just wait for Lindblom to get even more healthy, see exactly how these first couple of regular seasons go, and then when they get back to San Jose, really make a sort of decision on where exactly he's going to play in the lineup, and if Eklund and LeBanc and Cunnin played good enough to actually be in the Sharks' top six. When it comes to both Lorentz and VL, these are players who they're making the trip. I mean, Lorentz was okay. He very well might get some NHL games. I'm still not a huge fan of Jeff VL, but I suspect he'll play at least a few games this season as well. The other players who I expect to at some point factor into the Sharks' decision making is, of course, right at the start here. I'll mention both Reedy and Weatherby because these are players that did play some NHL games, actually a pretty decent amount of NHL games just last season. But another player who obviously came kind of out of nowhere in a way would be Daniil Gushin. He was a player who during the rookie face-off tournament, I mentioned that besides Eklund and Bordeleau, he was likely the most skilled of the Sharks prospects on the ice. However, his consistency was a bit of an issue, but during this preseason, he definitely played much more of a consistent game, capping it off with a hat trick against the Vegas Golden Knights just yesterday. And so there were a lot of questions there of whether or not Gushin could actually make it on the trip to Europe, because he seemed like, a week ago, if you had asked someone if he was going to be able to make that trip, they would have probably laughed in your face and said there's no way Gushchin actually makes it. But the fact that he actually brought into the conversation was extremely, extremely impressive. Having said that, I don't actually think he should have made it onto this flight. This is partially because, again, preseason is extremely unpredictable, so there's no real way to say that Gushchin would obviously replicate that performance in the regular season. And then secondly, because of the player that Gushchin is, I don't want him actually playing, 9 or 10 minutes a game, maybe getting some second power play time on like the Sharks' third or fourth line. I would much rather him get significantly more minutes in the AHL to really hone his game and come back next year or something like that significantly stronger. So I don't actually hate that he was left off this list. The player who I do hate being left off this list as we move on to the defensive side of things is, of course, Ryan Merkley. You see, the San Jose Sharks don't necessarily have that great of a defensive core. I mean, just last season, they also didn't have very good of a defensive core, and it has only gotten worse with the departure of Brent Burns. Many of the really, really good teams have a strong back end. I mean, just look at the Stanley Cup winning team. Cale Makar is obviously just an elite defenseman. Devon Taves is also extremely strong. Bowen Byram had a fantastic playoffs for them. If I take a look at the San Jose Sharks defensive core, there's Erik Karlsson, sure, and maybe if the Sharks somehow get the Erik Karlsson from 6 years ago, he's going to lead the way and the Sharks won't need any other players and they could have 5 traffic cones filling out the last 5 spots, but that's unlikely to happen. When you look past Erik Karlsson, there's then Mario Ferraro, and he's definitely a top 4 defensive caliber player, but past Ferraro and Karlsson, who's the next best defenseman on the San Jose Sharks? Maybe Matt Benning, who's like at best a 5th defenseman. I mean, the fact that the Sharks managed to sign him for 4 years at $1.25 million, that's the contract that you give a player who you don't even expect to have them play the entire regular season. So realistically, Benning is much more of like a 6th defenseman, and he's their 3rd best defenseman they are bringing to Europe. If I take a look at Shemek, Vlasic, Cicek, Harrington, Megna, there are literally none of these players who, if I were to put them on an actual like competitive Stanley Cup vying team, that would actually make it onto their defensive top 6. Vlasic hasn't been good in many years. Shemek, it's technically possible Shemek could make a comeback. I could see that happening, but he hasn't been good for a couple of years. Megna, I was rather impressed with this past season, but I don't think that necessarily makes him anything more than like a 6th defenseman until he shows even more than that. Cicek is more of an AHL guy, I find, and Harrington is a tryout player that the San Jose Sharks signed after a couple of okay preseason performances. When this first pairing of Ferraro and Karlsson, who I am expecting to be the first pairing, though maybe the Sharks will spread the love through the first couple of pairings, when Karlsson and Ferraro aren't on the ice, which is going to happen for probably more than half of the game, the Sharks will have essentially nobody on the back end driving any sort of offense or even being all that great. And right now, 20 years ago, you could have gotten away with something like that. But in 2022, 2023, this season, and for the past few seasons as well, you want to have some sort of offense coming from your back end. And the Sharks have essentially 6 offensive black holes on the blue line at this point. It's actually kind of sad to watch. I mean, already the Sharks have decided through their 8 players that they've brought to Europe to only have 2 right-handed shooting defensemen, which is why I thought that Merkley would be a lock at the very least to make this trip so that the Sharks could actually have 3 right-handed shooting defensemen, but it seems as though the Sharks are going to have to play somebody on their wrong side. And if I take a look, just look at these pairings. You have Ferraro and Karlsson. You know what? This is a fine first pairing, especially if Karlsson actually sort of steps up into this role. I look at the second pairing. Benning and Shemek would make for a decent third pairing, not for a second pairing that you're going to end up playing like 18 to 20 minutes a night. And then the third pairing is Vlasic, who I don't see any way he's going to ever get any better, considering he just keeps getting older by 1 year. If there was a time for him to rebound, it was probably like 3 years ago. And then Scott Harrington, the paid tryout player. It's just a pitiful defensive unit, I must say. And, you could say, well, there's the injury to Nudivara, and that is definitely true. I would say Nudivara without Benning would probably be the Sharks' 3rd best defenseman who could be like serviceable top 4 style. But it seemed as though really that the Sharks needed a player like Ryan Merkley to give even a slight offensive spark past Erik Karlsson. Who is going to actually be the defenseman who plays on the second power play? Is it going to be Mario Ferraro? Because we have seen multiple times over the past couple of seasons Ferraro be given the opportunity on the Sharks power plays, and it very, very rarely ever worked out all that well, because it seems as though Ferraro, even though it's still early in his development somewhat, and things can definitely change, he doesn't really bring that much of an offensive element to his game. Ryan Merkley was far and away the Sharks' second most skilled offensive defenseman on this team, and he's not even going to be a possibility for the Sharks' first 2 games of the regular season. And so, the Nashville Predators aren't necessarily the most offensively gifted team in the NHL, so I don't know exactly how much the San Jose Sharks are going to get abused by the fact that they're running a pretty weak defensive core over these first couple of games, but especially once the Sharks get to play against the higher level teams in the NHL, this core is going to get absolutely smacked around unless some crazy sort of trap type of defensive system is implemented by David Quinn here. It's just a massive question mark for me for why Ryan Merkley was left off the list. The Sharks don't really have that luxury to pass on a player of his talent, even if the defensive game you think isn't there. Is Cicek and Harrington really better options to actually increase the Sharks' chances of winning these games when their primary issue going back from last season and the season before that and the season before that has been the offense? I don't think so. On the goaltending side of things, we of course have Kähkönen and Reimer. Since the Sharks are going to be playing a back-to-back with the Nashville Predators in Europe, I suspect both of these goalies to get one of those games. Kähkönen might be getting game 1. Maybe it'll be Reimer. I don't think that's going to necessarily be super indicative of who is going to be the major starter to start off the season for the San Jose Sharks. Arundel also made the trip, of course, in case of injury, but he is not going to be an option to be the starter for either of those 2 games unless an injury actually does occur. So that will do it for this season preview. The Sharks preseason went decently well, but again, there aren't that many amazing sweeping conclusions that we can actually draw from that. And in terms of the roster that is going to be going to Europe for the San Jose Sharks to play those first 2 regular season games, I thought on the forward side things were good, but on the defensive side it brought up a lot of question marks, and I am very worried about it. Class dismissed.